Hello, my name is Jim Turk, and I'd like to welcome you to the third in the Center for Free Expression series, Threats to Press Freedom. In our first episode, we focused on Kashmir, and our second on Afghanistan. Today, we turn to Russia. Before we start, though, I want to begin by acknowledging that the traditional territory on which I am speaking to you is that of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed by multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I also want to thank the co-sponsors for today's panel, which are the Canadian Association of Journalists, the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, PEN Canada, and World Press Freedom Canada. Today's panel is titled Putin's War on Journalists. As they say, truth is the first casualty of war. But Russian President Vladimir Putin has taken that a dangerous step further, directly targeting journalists who dare to report the truth. Over the years, Russian journalists have been threatened, imprisoned, arrested, beaten, tortured, and censored. But now, to wage his war in Ukraine, Putin has stepped up the attacks, all but silencing any remnants of an independent media within Russia. Our panel of eminent journalists will talk about how they and other journalists coped with the period leading up to the war, what happened after the passage of the law in March that effectively criminalized any independent journalism, how Russian journalists have continued their work in exile, and what the future of journalism in Russia looks like. I'd like to now introduce our panelists to you. The first is Ekaterina Kotrikadze. Ekaterina was the news director and anchor for TV Rain, Dozhd TV in Moscow. It was the last independent television channel in Moscow that was forced to shut down in the beginning of March this year, and Ekaterina had to flee Russia. Ekaterina graduated summa cum laude from the Moscow Lomonosov State University, after which she began her long and impressive career as a journalist. She was on Danger Zone program on TVC channel in Moscow. She was a reporter for Alania TV channel in Georgia. She was a journalist and expert in the field of international relations and foreign policy for the independent Russian radio station Echo of Moscow. In October 2009, Ekaterina became one of the founders of the Russian language television channel PIK, rising to the position of general director. And she's also served as a deputy editor-in-chief of RTVI, a privately owned international Russian language television network. Welcome, Ekaterina.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jim.
Our second panelist is Alexey Kovalev. Alexey is a Russian journalist who was born in Moscow and has spent most of his life there, except for 3 years in London, where he got his master's degree in international journalism in 2010 and reported for Russian news magazines. Currently, he's the investigative editor of Meduza, an independent media organization now based in Riga, Latvia. He was forced to emigrate from Russia in early March to 2022, just this last March, after the law criminalizing all independent reporting was brought in. Alexey has been working as a journalist for almost 20 years, mostly for local and national papers, magazines, and news websites. He's been an occasional contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and other Western media. Welcome, Alexey.
Hi there.
And Alexey's joining us on a train, as you may see in the background. So we appreciate you arranging to do this.
Let's hope the onboard Wi-Fi holds.
Yes, we have our fingers crossed. Our third panelist is Maxim Trudelubov. Maxim was born in Moscow, and he's had an impressive career as a journalist. He anchored a talk show on the radio station Echo in Moscow. He was editor and correspondent for the newspaper Capital. He was a writer and translator for the Moscow Times, an English language online newspaper. From 2003 to 2015, he was editorial page editor of Vedomosti, an independent Russian business daily. He's editor at In Liberty. He is editor-in-chief of Russia File, a blog of the Kennan Institute, where he's a senior fellow. And he has been a contributing opinion writer for the International New York Times since the fall of 2013. He also has won the Paul Klebnikov Fund's Prize for Courageous Russian Journalism and was a Yale World Fellow in 2009 and a Nieman Fellow at Harvard in 2010-11. Welcome, Maxim.
Hi, hello. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Jim, for your generous introduction.
Well, we're very pleased that you were able to join us. Our fourth panelist is Chris Brown. Chris is the foreign correspondent with CBC News, having served as the CBC foreign correspondent in Moscow from 2015 until last July. He traveled extensively in Russia, from the Arctic to the Caspian Sea, from the Baltic enclave of Kaliningrad to the far eastern city of Vladivostok. He's covered conflicts previously in Afghanistan and Syria, and was on site in Indonesia and Japan in the aftermath of the 2004 and 2011 tsunamis. He's been gassed, he says, in Hong Kong, traveled to the Islamic State bastions in central Syria, and filed from inside the Chernobyl red zone. He's been a winner of multiple awards for his journalism. He began his career as a radio reporter in Halifax and in Fredericton, and was also previously based in Victoria, British Columbia. Most recently, and you may, for those of you in Canada, you may have heard him, he's been reporting live from Ukraine, covering the Russian war on Ukraine. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jim.
And the moderator for this panel is Julian Cher. Julian is quite an outstanding and distinguished Canadian journalist. He was senior producer at CBC Fifth Estate, investigative journalist for the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. He's the author of 6 widely acclaimed books. He's filmed, written, and produced major documentaries across the globe and covered scandals, wars, and corporate intrigue. He's the winner and 3-time nominee for Gemini, Canada's equivalent to Emmys and for TV. He's a recipient of the Governor General's Award for Meritorious Public Service for uncovering miscarriages of justice. He trains journalists internationally in Syria and other countries. And just last month, Julian's documentary entitled Ghosts of Afghanistan won the top award for the best documentary at the Canada Screen Awards, our equivalent of the Emmys and the Oscars, and also won Best Editing and Best Writing. We're delighted to have you with us again, Julian. Welcome.
Good to be here with such a distinguished panel, Jim.
The format for the audience, the format for today's conversation is that Julian and the panelists are going to talk for 45 to 55 minutes, after which they're going to turn to you for questions. If you could look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says Q&A. The chat function is turned off in this Zoom webinar version, but the Q&A button is operative. So if a question comes to mind that you would like to ask any of the panelists, please just click on the Q&A and write out your question when you think of it. You don't have to wait till we turn to the audience. So just write out your question, and when we come to that section of the today's event, Julian will turn to Ange Holmes, the coordinator of the center, and she will share the questions that we have for the panel. That's all I have to say. Over to you, everyone.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm sure, like me, all of you have been gripped by what's been going on in Ukraine, the war, the atrocities, and also what's been going on in Russia. I'm just honored. I've had the pleasure of talking with our 4 panelists over the last few weeks, and you're in for a treat over the next hour, given their frontline experience, their insight, and their perspective. So let's get started. You're all very opinionated journalists, so please jump in anytime. Let's have a good discussion. Don't wait for me to ask you a question. That being said, try to keep your comments to about a couple of minutes so we can get through everything we want to talk about. Let's start. I'd like to start with Ekaterina and Alexey. You're both independent journalists, and you've been in the Kremlin's crosshairs for years, really, but especially, of course, in the months leading up to the war. Ekaterina, Rain TV called itself the optimistic channel. How did that change as you began to give voice to the Ukrainian people as the war started?
Well, when you have a war, you cannot be optimistic, unfortunately. And everything that Russian government was doing and all the crimes that we were witnessing did not give us a choice. There was not a situation when you could smile or you could talk about anything else. And this is the reason actually why TV Rain was shut down. Formally, we have shut down our channel by our own decision because again, we did not have a choice. There was a law adopted in Russia which actually declared all the journalists out of law. And it was a criminalization of our job or our profession. And the members of Russian parliament have actually decided that if you are trying to say anything about this war, truthfully, if you quote, for example, Zelensky or other representatives of Ukrainian government, if you try to understand what are the casualties from our side, from the Russian side, if you try to understand what are the reasons Vladimir Putin is invading a neighboring country, then they can put you in prison for up to 15 years, 15. Can you imagine? And you know, after we understood that this was the reality, we could stay optimistic and just, you know, shut eyes on what was going on in our country, not only in Ukraine, but also in the country that we used to live, that we used to love. But it would mean that we were not journalists anymore. So not optimistic anymore.
You didn't have much choice. Alexey, leading up to that huge crackdown in March, Meduza, of course, was known for its fearless investigations, but you came to be branded as traitors and spies, and yet you had sources inside Putin's government. How did that work? How were you able to get your stories out before the crackdown? Whoop.
I think there's a technical problem.
Alexey that's right. Alexey might have frozen. Let me, he'll try to reboot, but he's on a train. Max, you've been a columnist, a thinker, if you will, with a lot of experience in Russia. I was struck by, you said you're in the business of soul searching. And I wonder, if you look at how some countries and journalists engaged with Putin for many years before the war, what regrets or even guilt do you feel about how journalists inside and outside Russia covered him before the war broke out?
It's not that we engaged with him, and it's not an apology. I think it's just to say that when we started this project that was Vedomosti Daily, started in 1999, the year Mr. Putin actually went famous. That was the year everybody knew him. He was prime minister, then president. The question, who is Mr. Putin, was I think in the year 2000. And we were starting this business daily, which was both a Financial Times of Russia and the Wall Street Journal of Russia. The idea was to find people, expertise of the best kind, think in terms of, you know, the best practice in everything that we could think of: healthcare, banking, managing Russia's oil and gas patrimony, all that. And we were instrumental, for example, in persuading the Russian government to create a stabilization fund, something that is now, you know, wealth management fund, whatever it is. So that was the time when everything was in flux, and we were thinking in terms of helping Russia to get to create a management system, a government that is more like a management system, thinking about it in terms of getting the best possible practice, getting the best possible experience, attracted. Obviously, that was all, you know, from the goodness of our hearts. It wasn't in any way, you know, collaboration. Obviously, no one would think about that in those kinds of terms. Although right now, in hindsight, when looking back on that, I don't think that I'm sorry for what I've been doing, but I keep thinking that I gave more than 10 years of my life to trying to help, essentially not more like government actually, to help it run, rule, manage in a better way, using the best examples, using the best practices from the rest of the world. And this is the kind of the thought I'm stuck with right now. I'm still processing. It's hard to cancel your past. And I used to be proud of what we've done. It used to work until 2015. Then the newspaper was sold and it stopped. Yeah.
Let me pick up on what you just said and ask Chris, because Chris is well known to many people in Canada for trying to explain Russia to Canada and the Western world. Chris, looking back now, how do you think you and other Western journalists covered the Putin years? Would you have done anything differently? Hindsight is a privilege we now have.
You know, we were quite determined. CBC had been in Russia for a long time, and then for budgetary reasons, our permanent English bureau closed and we reopened it. And when I went in, we made a determined thought between myself and my producer, Corinne Semenoff, that we were going to try to avoid caricatures, we were going to avoid stereotypes, avoid cliches, and try to bring some nuance to this country that in a lot of ways had a lot in common with Canada. And so we wanted to not just focus on Putin, we wanted to focus on the emergence of Russian civil society, look at the fights that they were fighting against some of the backward thinking, to do stories about human rights and sexual harassment and the environment, and then to take people to places in Russia that Canadians would appreciate, like the Arctic, Lake Baikal, and the Caucasus and things like that. And I felt at the time we were nailing it, except now I look at it and I think I missed like a key thing. To me, the anti-Western stuff that Putin was spouting, I always felt it was largely, he might have believed it, but by and large, I felt it was largely a technique to keep him and his regime in power. And I didn't see it metastasizing and going beyond that into an actual war. I didn't believe that Russians would be willing to give up everything that they'd achieved in 30 years and follow him into a war against Ukraine. I did come to believe it. We got stopped by the FSB back in April, taking pictures of the buildup down near Voronezh and so forth. So that was when my thoughts turned. But, you know, I didn't appreciate that Putin's endgame was what it was. And this imperialistic thought was out there the whole time in plain sight. But we didn't quite grasp that it was actually, you know, the crazies on state TV were closer to the truth maybe than what we were.
Fascinating. Thanks. Glad you're back, Alexey. We're coming up to the big crackdown in March, and what I wanted to ask you is, you were not just covering news. Meduza was known for its investigation. How hard was it? You were being branded as traitors and spies, and yet you had sources inside Putin's government. Before the crackdown, how did you manage to to get your investigative stories out?
Regarding our sources in the government, yes, indeed, even after our foreign agent designation, we met people from the deputy ministers and people in the presidential administration, because as it turns out, in my experience as an investigative journalist, this middle kind of layer of people in the middle, approximately deputy minister level. So this would be the most people the most dissatisfied with their work, because they were already quite advanced in their careers. They're my peers in their early 40s, and people who already saw the system to be irreparably rotten and corrupt. But it was already too late for them to quit. They've gotten too used to their entire lives. Their families dependent on their government jobs with all their perks. So these were the people who saw the system, who were accessible, and they saw the only outlet. They saw us as the only outlet for their dissatisfaction with the system, because they saw how many years ago they already saw the direction it was going, the direction Russia was going, and these would be our most valuable sources. And for them, it didn't matter whether we were the foreign agent or not. Yes, and despite even with the foreign agent designation, the Kremlin couldn't just ignore us. Sure, we had many enemies, but we also had dozens of millions of people reading us. We had we had 30, maybe 40 million page views every month, and that is just something you cannot ignore or brush away as some tiny minority of dissenters. We were also invited to government briefings, to regular interviews with high-profile officials. So although we were, they would say nasty things about us on television and brand us as traitors and spies, foreign agents. The audience that we had meant that they couldn't just ignore us. So they had to contend with this. If they wanted to communicate with this audience, it's got to have to go through Meduza. So yeah, and it didn't even quite stop even after the war. It's just that there's a lot of more dissatisfaction in that kind of strata of the government. And now they're in the first phase of the war. They were all everyone I talked to was incredibly demoralized, and they thought they were just horribly sidelined by Putin. And then 2 weeks later, they were kind of doubling down on the rhetoric and trying to rationalize it and trying to rally behind the flag. So it's quite fascinating to watch. And sure, I mean, these people, like I said, these people are most trusted, most valuable sources, because they saw the system exactly for what it is, unlike the people on the lower rungs, and unlike the the ministers and the people from the Putin's immediate circle, who were just too inaccessible for us. But in many cases, it was they were just looking for a shoulder to cry on.
So you're all doing amazing work under extremely difficult conditions. But then, of course, as Ekaterina referenced, on March 4th, everything changes with the new law that basically criminalizes what you're doing. Briefly, Ekaterina, take us what's going through your mind that day when you land up playing Swan Lake and you have to walk away from the TV station that meant everything for you and your colleagues. What was it like to have to flee like that?
Well, it was I think it was one of the most terrible days during my career. Maybe it would be fair to say during my life, because it was not only about my career ending in Russia or my television station shutting down. It was about changing everything. It was about the country that we were losing, and we have lost it. Actually, I think it's important to acknowledge that there is no Russia anymore. Russia that we knew, that we loved, in spite of the complicated situation, in spite of the Putin's authoritarianism, in spite of the you know, huge issues with human rights and so on and so forth. But still, we could breathe there. We could work there. We could live there with our kids. I have 2 kids, and I wanted them to study in Russian school, exactly the school that I wanted for my son to be in, right? And just like that, one day, they have decided that they don't want me there anymore. And I have a feeling that they didn't have, for that stage, I mean, for the first stage of this war, they didn't want us to be in jail. They were just forcing us out. I mean, everything that they were doing is, you know, construction of the environment, of the atmosphere, where you just cannot work. You cannot stay, because you are in a panic attacks all the time, and also because you understand that you are banned. Even if you stay, even if you are brave enough, you will not have an opportunity to work because everything is shut down. There is no any single independent media source and organization in Russian Federation right now. So we have decided to leave the country during a couple of hours.
Wow.
After I was on air, I went back home, and then I went back home, and I've got this push notification about the banning of the website of television that I used to work for. And also there was a push notification, breaking news of banning of Echo of Moscow, the only independent radio station that was also forced to shut down eventually, as you know, Echo of Moscow. So it was like the evening when we understood that there was no chance that we could stay there. And we have packed two suitcases. We have taken our 2 sons, me and my husband, who is an editor-in-chief of TV Rain. And at 5 a.m. in the morning, we were already driving to the airport. But I was thinking that he would be detained, or I would be detained at the border. They did not detain us. They did not interrogate. I think, and also there were other journalists, tens, hundreds, leaving the country during this exactly the same period of time. We've met so many people in the airport, you cannot even imagine. You know, there were some of them who were interrogated. They were asking them questions, checking their phones, trying to find what people were chatting about, Ukraine and things like that. But at the end of the day, all of them did leave the country. They did have this opportunity and possibility. It means that to them, as I said, it was important to get rid of us. You know, they just didn't want us to be there.
Alexey, what was that day and night for you? You've been a tough investigative journalist. I'm sure you had to meet sources in dark alleys, all kinds of risks. And then like that, suddenly your life changes. Take us through those hours that you had to live through.
Okay, actually, I knew that this would happen, so it didn't came as quite as a shock, because I knew this day would come, and I just wanted to stay in Russia for as long as I can, just to be
Everyone knew.
See it with my own
we
eyes.
all knew it.
Yeah,
but it's
They
still.
Yeah, we all knew it.
It was
and,
still a surprise.
And yes, and I was on March 2, I was still making plans for the next week. I went to a local clinic to get some tests for a treatment that I'd been planning. All this time, my wife, an incredibly prescient woman, has been telling me, "You're a fool. We need to leave now. We need to be packing our bags. Why are you wasting your time on this?" And of course, she turned out to be right, because when I came back from the clinic, I got a call from a friend who said, "Look at the website of our parliament, the Duma. It has two chambers, and in quite an extraordinary event, both were supposed to be in session on Friday, March 4th. So the rumors started circulating that on March 4th, martial law would be introduced in Russia, which would quite certainly mean the end of free press, and also quite possibly closed borders. And I didn't want to get, me and my wife, we didn't want to get trapped in Russia and in martial law. So yeah, next morning it was clear that we need to get out, like right now. But the EU airspace was already closed to Russian flights, and we heard stories about flights being diverted mid-air, and we also had a dog, which further complicated things. So we basically just packed a couple of bags, grabbed our dog, booked a cab, went to the border. It took us 9 hours to get there, another 3 hours to cross the border, and people picked us up, our friends picked us up on the other side and took us to Riga. And when we arrived the morning of March 4, we found out that they didn't quite introduce martial law, but they came quite close, this close. So we found out on the morning that we arrived in Riga on March 4, we found out that Meduza's website was blocked for disseminating false information about the Russian armed forces or something like that. But also on that day, these two sessions of the parliament, they did pass a law, like Katerina said, which basically criminalized their profession. And seeing that by then I had already filed quite a few incriminating articles, byline stories, which would quite surely lead to prosecution under this new law. You know, at that moment, we knew that we made the right call. And now, you know, despite the fact that I've spent a few years abroad and I've been mentally preparing for this, it's still quite traumatic because I had to leave my entire home behind. I know my flat is just sitting there empty and it's not just like destroyed in a shelling like in Kiev, but it's still, you know, I like it in Riga, but it's not my home. I really want to go back home.
Obviously, I want to leave as much time for what both of you are doing now to keep the story going. But before we get there, Chris, you know, the Western media stayed in what was then the Soviet Union during the Stalin purges, during World War II, during all the Cold War. And yet now we've seen CBC, I believe New York Times, BBC, a lot of Western news organizations decided, at least temporarily, to pull out. Why was that decision made, and how hard was it for you as a Western journalist to see those postings close?
Well, I think actually the BBC may be one of the few, if not the only ones, who are still there. But I can tell you, after Navalny was imprisoned, the anti-Western sentiment became very intense in Moscow. Even it became harder to get interviews. We were tracked. I knew that for sure when we booked hotels and booked flights. And I think, you know, so this in some ways, our experience as foreign journalists, very different and not as dangerous, obviously, as the Russians. But we did have Russian staff who worked with us, camera people and so forth. And so, you know, the worst that could probably happen to us is we could be expelled. They didn't renew our visas, whatever the case was. But, you know, the Russians we were with, we were always very careful. We got stopped twice in 3 months by the FSB, put in those little buhankas that they'd have there and questioned and interrogated about what we were taking pictures of. And it was quite scary, particularly for our Russian staff. So really the decision was not a difficult one to leave. I mean, it was difficult, but it was kind of there in front of you, especially when, you know, you couldn't even report that it was a war from Russia. And, you know, I also felt as Canadians, frankly, we don't have the same clout anywhere in the world as the Brits or as the Americans do. The BBC is still there, and I tend to think in part that's because they're an extension of Britain and almost an extension of the British government, which is a serious, very serious entity. And as Canadians, no one was coming in to rescue us if we needed help. So it was a good time to read the tea leaves.
Max, you know, you from Washington, you've been trying for many years through the Russia files to try to, you know, explain, decipher Russia to the world, and I guess especially to America. How hard is it now when the kind of there's this shuttering of the independent Russian media? How hard does it make it for you and others to try to get the truth out?
Well, I'm not in Washington. I just spent there a year as a fellow. I'm mostly based in Lithuania, in Vilnius, and sometimes in Berlin. So basically, and up to very late before the war, I would travel to Moscow and stay there for as long as I could just to be there, talk to people, and feel what was going on. So when Vedomosti Daily essentially ended for me, that was 2015 when it was sold, and we knew what was going on. We tried to prevent it, etc. Long story, but basically, we all realized what was going on, and we were expecting that for a while, but that was, one of the steps on this long, more than 20 years long fight against the free press in Russia. I mean, Putin's been consistent. It started immediately since day one, essentially. So it's interesting that we lived that long. Anyway, institutionally, let's say institutionally. So now it's difficult, basically, when the connection is broken. Obviously, we all have the connection to everyone who's still there. I do have friends there. Many left. I would say that like 2/3 of my close friends are outside of Russia, but wow. one third still there. People doing culture, people doing arts, also journalism as well. Very few, but still there. So you can talk to people, but you don't have the benefit of actually feeling and experiencing, talking to people. That's obviously that is a bad thing, and the important thing is to keep this connection. But one thing I conclude by saying that one important part of my thinking, and not just my thinking, many people's thinking right now, is what happens to Russia. I mean, we are in a phase which looks like a sort of a closing phase of something. We will see a different Russia at some point. We don't know what time exactly, but this war is incredibly fateful. It's an event that is testing almost everything we knew and believed and thought about our country. I mean, let alone Ukraine. I mean, that's a patriotic war. It's a great patriotic war for Ukraine, for the Ukrainians, but it's a grim and terrible reality check for Russia, the Russians. And so we are in the process, I think, in rethinking what is Russia, what is our place, how it feels, what it means to be a citizen of Russia. You remain Russian, you keep your identity. What's your identity now? Well, yeah.
Well, let's spend the last 20 minutes we have before the questions to talk about that rethinking, and especially the work that's going on now. Ekaterina has to leave us in 20 minutes because she's going live for her TV show. So Ekaterina, if you could explain how where you are now in Tbilisi, and how is Rain TV now using social media to get the message out? And particularly talk about, you mentioned once how young people you think are a bit ahead of Putin, and maybe that could be a secret weapon you could use.
Well, first of all, I would like to add a couple of words to what Max was talking about. Absolutely. It's really important. It's the thing that we are all concerned with, who we are, what the country is, what are we as the citizens of Russian Federation. These are the questions that we don't have answers for. I mean, everything has changed after this war. And also, the identity of millions of Russians has changed because they were used to live in the country which had a great victory in the World War II, in the Great Patriotic War, the country which fought and won in a war with Nazism and fascism. And right now, this country commits the same crimes. Can you imagine? This is something that we need to acknowledge, and and for a lot of people, it would be a very devastating, a very complicated, a very hard moment when they realize what was going on, and what Russian army has done in Ukraine. This is the first thing. Second is that my job and my mission, please apologize my words. I don't know what other words can I find for this, but the idea of what we're doing right now on YouTube, not on television, unfortunately, is to prepare the society of Russia, is to prepare as many people as we can for what they're gonna understand, what they're gonna acknowledge, what they're gonna live in after years, maybe, or after months, maybe. We don't know that. We have launched our own YouTube stream and YouTube channel together with my husband. It's called Kotrikadze. It's on YouTube. And also a couple of our hosts from TV Rain, they have also done the same. They have their own YouTube channels. So I'm having a stream. This is pretty much the same that we were doing before. We are talking about news. We are talking to the guests. We invite guests on Skype, on Zoom, and you know, it's not so hard to operate these days because of internet, because of these opportunities. And of course, when I think about this young generation of people, the hope comes back to me, because sometimes I don't have this hope at all. You know, after what what the country went through and what the country is going through so far, it's not easy to believe in something better. But I think that better days will come, because Vladimir Putin, of course, he was, and he is now, he is a dictator. Because before, maybe he was an autocrat or something like that, but still, he did not ban YouTube in Russia. There was a YouTube. There was an opportunity to go online. There was an opportunity to go on Facebook and Instagram, which are banned right now. But you know, everyone uses it. Everyone knows how to use VPN, including Russian officials who use it, who use VPNs, and who post on Instagram and Facebook. This is amazing, but they do. I mean, everyone knows the rules of the game. And you know, I think that these people, young people who are educated, who speak languages, who are grown up with Putin, but with new generation of social media, they will understand eventually that there is no more time to wait. So I want to be with them. I want to help them, and I want to go back home, really. And I think it's gonna happen. It's gonna happen someday. Yeah. So, but, and you know what? One more thing. We are having a lot of viewers, and the audience is rising. It really means that this is not true when they say that the whole Russia supports Vladimir Putin and the whole Russia is for this so-called special military operation, which is not a special military operation, because it's a war, and you know, you don't have any special operations which last like 70 days plus. But anyways, you know, we have very good audience. People are texting us, are asking questions, and we will relaunch TV Rain very soon. I hope in a couple of maybe months, and we will talk to people, and we will have Russian audience, and we will try to knock all the doors and all the windows. And the first thing is that we need to reach people who are not exactly sure what's going on, because there are a lot of them. I mean, it's impossible to talk with the people who like are crazy and who really believe that Russia is fighting NATO and Nazis in Kiev and blah blah. But there are a lot of millions, I think, Russians who just are in denial, who are depressed, who don't understand what's going on, who need the alternative sources. So us and Meduza and other independent, qualified journalists will be there for them.
Well said, well said. Alexey, Meduza's mandate has always been investigations. You've obviously been devoting now with the war a lot of energies in documenting allegations of war crimes by Russia in Ukraine. Why is that so important for you now as Meduza's mission?
Okay, the way I'm explaining it to myself is that I've learned the hard way that it's simply not enough to just send the link an article which describes in a factual article on-the-ground reporting that describes in vivid detail what's really going on in Ukraine to change someone's mind. Maybe there's like a 1 in 100 chance that if they're especially perceptive to a different point of view. But other than that, I'm not hoping that my reporting or Meduza's will immediately allow millions of Russians to see the lights of the truth. No, it's not. That's not how it works, because it's really when I'm telling people, look, we have evidence of Russian soldiers committing horrible war crimes for an illusion, for a lie. What people are telling me in response is not that it's not true, or it's all fake news, or I don't trust your source. What they really are telling me is that you're asking me to pull out one brick on which my entire worldview is built. If I pull it out, my entire worldview comes crashing down. A worldview where Russia is the good guy, and a worldview where we've been voting for President Putin for 20 years now because he promised us a vision of the future. And if this is the future that we've been voting for 20 years, how can I ever acknowledge it? This is what I'm asking people to do. Just try and get to anyone to say my country is committing war crimes. So I'm not hoping for, I'm not really hoping, despite the fact that we have millions of people on our website at any given moment, that's still just a fraction of Russia's entire adult TV and newspaper audience. What I'm hoping to do, and I'm quite serious about it, if for all the work I've done, if just one article ends up as a footnote in a prosecution statement to the Future War Crimes Tribunal, I'm content with that. My mission is complete if that happens. And wow. I'm working towards that end. Maybe if along the way someone who buys Putin's version of reality stumbles upon my article and reads it and just says, "Oh my God, this is really what's happening," I'm fine. I mean, that would be a nice side effect. But my mission is just to work towards at least some version of closure, at least some justice for the victims, for the hundreds of people in Ukraine I've spoken to.
We've obviously been talking a lot about the war in Ukraine. Chris is the one person here who's been there, whose mission is right now to help CBC as part of the Western coverage cover that war. Chris, what's been your biggest challenge in trying to get the truth out about what's going on in the war in the Ukraine?
Obviously it's a war and journalists have died, and your personal safety is always a big one. It's the biggest one. But both what Max and what Ekaterina and what Alexey said, there's so much of that you hear from the other perspective when you're in Ukraine that really stands out. Like, I have been to Bucha, I've been to Irpin, I've been to the battle at Hostomel. I've seen all these spots. But for Ukrainians, I think what struck me was that many felt that they had been at war for 8 years already before any of these battles took place because of what happened in 2014. But I think the nature of that war dramatically shifted. And I don't think it's too much to say, I never really detected in all the trips we made to Ukraine deep animus and hostility towards Russians as a people. A lot of it was directed towards Putin and the regime that he represented. But I have to say, in the last, since we've been going back since February 25th, that's changed. And the fury is deep and very pervasive. And it, unfortunately, I think, and I do say this, unfortunately, a lot of it's even directed at Russian liberals. I didn't get the sense that anyone saw Alexei Navalny as a savior for this. I didn't get a sense that very many Ukrainians saw that this deep ingrained imperialism, which is what they see it as, was going to dramatically change with someone like, for example, Navalny, the anti-Putin, as the leader, because in their minds, Navalny supported the Crimea and wasn't going to give it back. And so this is a very deep thing that I don't know how this is overcome. Exactly what Maxim said, you know, this is a grim reality check. I don't see too many Russian heroes that are going to be acceptable or that are going to be seen as heroes now in places such as Ukraine.
I want to give Ekaterina a chance to talk before we lose her in about 10 minutes. You could see she's getting ready for her show. But just before, Maxim, how they, you know, Alexey and Ekaterina are talking about documenting history and keeping the Russian government to account. From your perspective, how important is it to document these crimes and holding the government to account, particularly given Russia's history of kind of failure of keeping governments to account?
Well, it's paramount.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure. I mean, is it, Catherine, are you talking? Okay.
No. I missed the question, sorry.
Okay. We'll get to you
so basically what I'm saying is that it's paramount. It's absolutely important. And yes, it goes against everything we know about Russia's path, as it were. Russia's state, as we know it today, I mean, we can argue when it started, but it's at least 500 years. It's sort of Muscovite Russia, and it's never been anywhere close to a democratic state. Also, we did have our moments at the beginning of the 20th century, but basically it doesn't really matter. What I think what matters is what Russian society is prepared to do. And it's a big thing. If it happens, if Russian society is able to create an independent, institutionally independent court, an organization, a branch of government, if you will, that will be independent enough to pronounce judgments on the dealings of the state of Russia, the Russian state, that used to govern everything in this country for at least 500 years. In case that is possible, Russia has a future. I mean, it may sound a bit far-fetched, but to me, it's that important. If we are able to produce something like that, then we can think of, continue to think, you know, in terms of institutional design. I mean, the way I used to think, the way I used to be doing it back in, let's say, 2000s, that were comparatively sort of promising years for Russia, when we could think in terms of institutional design. How do we do this? How we do that? You know, how do we reform this? You know, healthcare, education, municipal management, etc., waste management, where all kinds of things. Brilliant, interesting, using everything we could from the experience of the best countries, cities, municipalities from the rest of the world. Any of that is beside the point right now. Right now, the question is, when the war ends, how we all emerge from that. I mean, the Ukrainians are the focus of everything that's going on. We all have to help them. We all have to think about what, you know, how alleviate the terrible things that have been happening for the past more than 2 months now. And then how Russia emerges out of that. And to me, I mean, if you ask me, the one thing that's important is taking the people who started this war to account, so that Russia itself there will be an international trial, an international tribunal, yes, in one way or another. But it's important that something of the kind happens in Russia. An independent judiciary is created that is able to prosecute these people and think about Russia's past in more general terms, because, I mean, I'm concluding now, sorry, just a bit too long, but what's been happening in Ukraine for the past 2 months is, in a way, a reenactment of crimes that the Russian state has been committing in its vicinity for At least 100 minutes, and we can go even further. Yeah.
Well, let's ask Ekaterina to pick up on that in the last few minutes before you go to air, Ekaterina. Your thoughts on what Maxim and all of us have been saying, and how you see the future, your future and the future of journalism in Russia.
You know, the future will be tough. We will work in Europe, I don't know for how long, but we will. Alexey is there already and they have experience. We don't have such an experience, but we are facing the reality. So I think we will move to Latvia or maybe other European country, and we will start all over again. We will start from scratch. We will try to be journalists without being inside of the country, which is a very complicated and tough and weird mission. You know, it's not easy to cover Russia without being there. And always, to me, it was, you know, I could not criticize the country when I was in the US, for example. I used to live in New York. I did not want to criticize Putin because, you know, he was not a good president for my country, but still I was out of it, right? It was not right, I thought, to say something about the situation in the country where I was not present. Now, the situation is absolutely different. We were forced to leave and we will be forced to work as journalists and cover Russia without being there. There's no choice for us. So we will try to find maybe some reporters in the country with the guarantees of security for them. We will try to find and figure out new techniques and new ways to build the television in exile. And the final thing is that I want to add again a couple of words to what Chris and Max were talking about. There will be a tribunal. There will be a court, and everyone will be punished. This is what I believe in, honestly. Because if you don't believe in such things, then everything loses its sense, right? And but I think it's very important to remember that Russians are very different. This is a big nation, 140 million people, and there are a lot of them who have never supported this war, who have never supported Vladimir Putin and his crimes, and who are not responsible for what's going on right now. And this is not just for societies of European countries or Western countries. It's for the governments of Western countries. It's to remember that you should not cancel the whole nation because of the crimes of its government. And yeah, this is one of the things we will cover as well, the different ways of being Russian. And thank you so much. I need to run right now. And it was a pleasure and an honor for me to be with you.
Well, it's an honor for you and I think it's so good that you have to leave us to broadcast the news and the truth to the people of Russia. So please continue your work. And there'll be a link tomorrow on the website so all of the people attending here can follow Ekaterina's work and stay in touch. Stay safe. Best to you, Ekaterina. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Alexey, building on what Maxim and Ekaterina said, you've been a journalist for 20 years through some of the toughest times. How do you see the future of journalism in Russia? I know it's hard to predict what's going to happen with the war, but how optimistic are you about the future of journalism?
I mean, we've been working from outside of Russia. We've been doing this since 2014. Because Meduza was born in adversity as a result of censorship. So it's not something new for us, although all this time I was in Moscow. I only left Moscow like 2 months ago. And we've been working remotely for the past 2 years. So again, nothing new. The only thing that we're really, as an investigative reporter, at least, the only thing that we are lacking now is those meetings with government officials. Only the ones that would always insist on face-to-face meetings, not on chats on secure messengers. But it's not really that much of a problem. So yeah, it also helps that this is probably the most online war in the history of wars. So there are thousands and thousands of hours of footage to analyze, and gigabytes upon gigabytes of material evidence to sift through. And one of the most bizarre aspects of this war is actually that the Russian government is meticulously documenting its own war crimes. So it's happened to me a few times that I'm talking to people in Ukraine and they're sending me a video clip saying, look, it was my house here, and there's a Russian tank shooting point blank at a residential building which just implodes. And there's a logo in the bottom right corner of the screen, RT. So they are actually broadcasting and documenting their own war crimes.
Wow.
Which is, it's a phenomenon I can't quite explain, but it's there. So yeah, it's you don't really have to be in Moscow unless or elsewhere in Russia to do most of the things that I'm doing now. So it's not really that much of a problem. So yeah, it's obviously if you want to do a vox pop, it's a lot more difficult. And if you want to go, one difficulty, for example, in a latest piece, one of the latest pieces we filed was going to a town in the Urals to track down a family of a possible perpetrator. Obviously, we had to ditch that idea because it was just too dangerous. None of us was there, and hiring a freelancer for such a dangerous job, which would quite probably got them arrested, we just couldn't risk that. So we had to ditch that part and find other ways to buttress our sources and the evidence that we had. So yeah, it's difficult in many aspects, but not irreparably difficult. Our reporting, I would say.
Oh, Alex, I was struck when you said before that your goal would be to be a footnote in a war crimes tribunal as a reference or proof. To what degree then have you given up on changing public opinion in Russia through your reporting? I mean, all journalists want to have an impact, getting the truth out, and people go, "Oh, I didn't know that." Have you given up on that people will see your reporting and maybe there'll be a change of opinion among some people in Russia?
Well, at least I'm not expecting it to happen immediately. I mean, it's the fog of propaganda is so thick that it's nearly not enough, even for the most groundbreaking revelation in Meduza, to change people's minds on a national level. Maybe if they're very receptive, like I said, maybe one link would be enough. But actually, you'd want to go to and see an article by Peter Pomerantsev in the Atlantic, where he interviewed a Ukrainian family which was basically trapped in a cellar for several weeks with Russian soldiers. And over several weeks, in their interactions and conversations, it took this like a very special, and probably the one that would be impossible to reproduce, a bond formed between the soldiers and the occupiers and the victims, and it took them about 3 weeks to change these soldiers' minds, because it was already there. The seeds of this doubt that it's not a just war was already there, because the soldiers saw that they had been lied to by their commanders, and they were already incredibly demoralized. But it took many hours for those people with a special bond between them to really change their minds about the nature of this war. So it would take many, many hours of conversations with a person with an implicit trust between you, like a relative or a family member, and still you would probably fail, like I have. So one article or 10 articles or many hours of Ekaterina's programming on TV Rain would not be enough, to turn around 20 years of brainwashing. So I'm not hoping to achieve anything immediate, but if it accumulates over time, that's the best I can hope for.
We have about 25 minutes left, and I think it's a good time to go to some questions, and let's hopefully leave time at the end also for all of you to give some closing thoughts. Ange, can you read us one of the first questions from the audience?
Yep, and I do want to remind attendees that you can use the Q&A button to ask questions at any point now. The first question is from Lisa, and Lisa says, first of all, thanks so much to all of you. It's an honor to hear from such an esteemed group. I am curious about the rumors of martial law at the start of March. So many people mentioned it to me at the time. I expect this came from somewhere in the government to encourage journalists and activists to leave. But do you know where it came from?
Alexey, the rumors about martial law?
So I tuned out for a few seconds. Are you asking me?
Yeah, the question was, that's right. The question was, where did the rumors of martial law come from? And was it maybe designed to try to force people like you to leave the country?
Quite probably, but you know, it's probably too complicated to drive someone out of the country. You know, I would probably expect a knock on the door from a policeman asking me to come in for questioning, like giving me a hint that I really shouldn't and I should pack my bags and leave at once. That what I would have expected to if somebody wanted to send me a clear signal that it's, you know, time to go. I think it's someone saw these incredible kind of coincidence that both chambers of the parliament were planned to be in session on March 4, and that's why a lot of people thought this is probably what it is. But in fact, it's not the parliament that introduces martial law; it's the president and the government. You know, I knew that I was supposed to you know, make the connection that it's not about the martial law, but still, you know, we came as close as it could be. So yeah, effectively, so under martial law, the, you know, freedom of the press is suspended, but also with this new law, it's all but suspended in practice.
Form of martial law.
Maybe it was, you know, maybe it was maybe the rumor scare people away out of Russia. I don't know, but you know, they did turn out to be at least partially true. So we have martial law all in practice, if not in the letter of law. I guess it was just someone being too cautious for their own goods. I mean, someone looked up the. You know, it's a funny thing because it was also incredibly when I went to confirm that was, you know, both chambers of the parliament were indeed in session. It was very hard to do at this point because Russian government websites were hacked. All of them were down. So it was, you know, it took me 5 minutes to get the parliament's website to open.
To find out. Huh.
So yeah, I mean, it's
all right.
It's quite likely that, yeah, it's quite likely that it was an intentional rumor, or maybe not. I don't know. The end result is still the same.
You're right, and the point is, it doesn't matter whether it was a rumor or not. We, in effect, you were in effect were living under martial law. Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question is from Joanna. Joanna asks, can you give me some updates on what's happening with the memorial project? Info in the media was very troubling about the documents destroyed, etc.
Max or Alexey? Yeah, Maxim, the memorial project, you should maybe explain it, what it was, this museum that documented human rights abuses, and it was shuttered. Yeah, can you talk briefly about it?
Yeah, Memorial is the oldest civil society group in Russia. If we start Russia, let's say the, you know, late 80s, early 90s, one of the very, very first NGOs officially registered in Russia. It even actually happened even before the Soviet Union collapsed. and very big names behind it, including academic Sakharov and the people who and the former president, Soviet Union last president, Mikhail Gorbachev. And there were people behind it that were leading lights of this movement of memory studies, history studies that had to do with the Soviet past. And for a while, it seemed that was one of the mainstream lines for Russia to go along, studying its own past, coming to terms with it, finding its own way of dealing with it. No one ever insisted of repeating, let's say, Germany's way of doing that, or anybody else's, or Japanese, or Argentinian, whatever, however you think about it. So that used to be a cornerstone of the civil society of Russia's civil society, and there's a plethora of organizations created around it, including human rights organizations that have been watching, but with watchdogs, also helping people, also creating educational enlightenment projects of all kinds. So that was a very important thing, and yes, the base, the foundation has always been a library, an archives that they've been collecting for more than 30 years now, which includes unique things like audio recordings, oral history, for example. There are voices there of people who are long gone by now. So it's a treasure. It's a treasure, and what I know is that most of it has been digitalized, and in case things happen, most of it will be preserved, and that's what people of Memorial have been busy doing for the past 2 months. Many of them left. Some of them actually stayed. The building, the premises still belong to them. And they made a point many years ago to own a building, and an actual part. It's a part of the building. Anyway, it's a real estate that they own, and they're still there. The collection is still, the archives are still there. So at this point, it's okay, but obviously we're talking about Russia, so there's no guarantee of anything, but we are all aware, and the Memorial, the people of Memorial are the first people who've been aware of what was to be done, and the archives is going to be preserved.
Let's hope. It's such a tragedy. It's so ironic that Alexey and you and Ekaterina are talking about documenting the current war crimes and holding the government to account, and here, one of the most important institutions is being silenced exactly on that.
Yeah, it's ironic. It's ironic. Russia had this unfinished business with this, and now we are on for a new business. Again, all here we go.
Yeah. And Angie, next question.
Yeah, the next question is from George. George asks, Maxim brought up the point that this is a pivot point for Russia. Would you all agree that this is the most significant pivot point for the world since World War II, given that countries are more or less being forced to align with allies either for or against Russia? And are you surprised at some of the countries that either support Russia or are not willing to criticize Russia? What hope do we have for this lack of harmony?
Complicated question. Chris, why don't you start, because you've had to cover the war and you're now in London. So to some degree, how much of a pivot point is this since World War II?
I think it's the biggest pivot point I've covered in 30 years of being a journalist. So I think it's a big pivot point. Is it the biggest? You know, I don't often think you know the answer to these things until after you're on the other side of the pivot point. But for the moment, it sure feels big, and it sure feels like something significant is happening in Ukraine. It feels like something very significant is transformed within Europe. There could be a lot of things that come out of this. You know, does the European Union become a military superpower after this, as well as an economic one? But you know, it's obviously the future of Russia is key. So many of the big inflection points of the 20th century were about Russia, right? The revolution, and then the fall of the wall, and now we're here now. And I think, you know, what happens to Russia after this will be as big an inflection point as the decision to invade Ukraine. Does it continue to be an empire, wannabe, or does it make a transition to becoming a democracy? And we're a long way from that, but that to me will be the pivot point as we go forward.
Ange, next question.
Yeah, the next question from an attendee, they ask, in addition to Western sanctions on Putin's insiders, key government officials, Russian billionaires, and plutocrats, there have also been widespread actions taken to isolate and break relations with Russian musicians, artists, athletes, writers, and academics because they are Russian, many of whom may be deeply troubled by what Putin's regime is doing. Do you feel this is helpful, or is it counterproductive?
Interesting debate. Alexey and Maxim, maybe you can talk about that because you must know some of these people.
Okay, look, we had to rebuild our Meduza. We had to rebuild our entire business model twice in 1 year, because first time was when we were declared a foreign agent, and we were a business. We were a very successful growing media business. But we lost 90% of our advertisers overnight because of the government's decision to designate us a foreign agent. The second time was when we had to, again, rebuild our entire business model, and when we had to reorient our entire crowdfunding model, because it was aimed mostly at Russians in Russia, because we had a very big audience in Russia, and there was an incredible wave of support, which was cut off in early March 2022, when Visa and MasterCard stopped servicing Russian clients. It wasn't the Russians, it wasn't Putin's actions that almost killed us the second time, twice in 1 year, but it was the Western response to the Russia's war. I'm not complaining. I mean, we got ourselves out of this. We reoriented ourselves towards a Western audience, which had no idea what we are. But we again survived. But whatever helps stop this war, I'm accepting it.
Maxim, can you address? Really, the question is going to the issue. I think of.
You know, it's really not about my comfort. You know, it's really whatever helps stop this war.
But Maxim, the question raises the issue of collective guilt, right? That, I mean, so what's your feeling on that? How much do ordinary Russians have to pay the burden for Putin's war?
Well, I believe that every society, Russian society, obviously will be looking for its own way of dealing with that. Right now, we're far away from any reckoning. It will take years. It will take a lot of effort. It's never easy. What I can say now is that I don't like to talk about guilt. Guilt is more like an individual thing that could be established in court. Those people who started the war, by the way, if they're found guilty, they will be, and there will be punishment. I consider myself, if not complicit, but responsible partly for what's going on. And the responsibility is something that that could be, we can think about it as something that we can share. Many Russians, I think, do share responsibility for what happened, because we were not active enough. We in a way, contributed to this regime in one way or another. I've never voted for this guy, and I've never been part of the system, never worked for the Russian state in any way. But I lived in Russia, and I was born in Moscow, lived in Russia all the way until 2015, and then would come very often. And I'm still citizen. I still have my voting rights and everything. So basically, there is a way of talking about it in political terms, I believe, not in terms of individual guilt. I don't feel any guilt in that sense, but I do feel responsibility, and I think that the next years and years and years will be devoted. That will be one of probably the theme for Russian society to work on how this war became even possible, how it happened, and why, and how we can deal with that, and how we can heal the wounds, which probably won't be healed completely, but at least we would, with time, unknown time at this moment, with time will come to a certain, well, closure, but this is so far off. This is so far away. It's only starting. I think it's a small bits of Russian society and individuals who understand what's going on. And in a way, it's one of the things that we all have to do. People who've already been thinking about it, to help others.
We have, Ange, I believe we have one more question, and then we'll have time for a closing thought from each of our panelists.
Yeah, the next question, it's another question from George, and George asks, is it time to kick Russia from the U.S. Security Council?
From the UN Security Council. Anybody want to take a stab at that? Chris, you've covered international politics.
I'm not sure.
I don't think there is a procedure. I may be wrong. Yeah, I don't think there is one. Russia is a,
I think you're right,
founding member.
Permanent, yeah. It's a permanent.
I mean, the Soviet Union and Russia sort of inherited the Soviet Union's stature in the world, including a seat on the permanent.
Yeah. Although it's interesting, just raising the question shows, as Chris pointed out, how much of a pivot point we're at, not just from Ukraine's point of view, but from the world's point of view. Well, look, we have a few minutes left, so I'd like to give each of our panelists a time for some closing thoughts. Chris, let's start with you. You're going to head back to Ukraine at some point. What are your thoughts as you're going to be heading back there? Even your personal thoughts. You've been around the world. You've seen everything. How are you sensing things right now?
Well, first, whenever I listen to people like Alexey and Maxim and Ekaterina, I'm always filled with hope, and I feel good after reading Meduza, and I feel good after reading Maxim's pieces in the Moscow Times and the many other places he writes for. This is why what the war struck me with it left me with so much dismay, because these were actually my takeaway moments from Russia. It wasn't the crazy stuff on state TV. It wasn't all that bluster. It wasn't the imperialism. It was the emergence of civil society groups that were trying to transform a country. And in a way, it's very good to hear the optimism, and I hope it stays. I really regret that, the great stories about Siberian tigers and Lake Baikal in the winter are not going to be heard for a long time now. It's just not going to happen. There's only one narrative that people are going to accept until, Russia renounces imperialism and goes on this deep exploration of what it means to be a Russian, which is what Maxim suggested, a grim reality check. Look, it's awful to go to see the war in Ukraine. It's dangerous. It's deeply troubling. It's it's awful to hear people express so much fury at Russians for the things that have happened in their communities and the people that have died. And I just really hope that it ends. But I think that part of it is super important. And I think being in Russia has, for as long as I was, has driven home, has just made it feel that much closer for me to go and be there and write about it.
Just picking up on what you said before, if you're talking to a Ukrainian in a bombed out home and you're trying to tell them, hey, I just spent an hour and a half with 3 brave Russian journalists who are speaking out against the war, well, you were saying that that's not going to have any, right? They're not interested they don't believe in the good Russians.
I think there's very few of them in Ukrainian minds, and I don't think it's a surprise at all. I think, Ukrainians went to the streets. I think there were 1 million of them in Maidan Square in 2014 and kicked out a corrupt government and replaced it. And not just replaced the government, but replaced a value system. And they don't see Russians doing that. Where are the 1 million people in Moscow? Where are the 1 million people in St. Petersburg? They're not there. And if there was, I think they would feel differently. And that's not to take anything away from the 15,000 people who've been arrested and put their lives on the line, but they just don't see it.
Maxim, closing thoughts. How optimistic are you about the country that clearly you love and you have fought for so many years?
Well, I don't feel optimistic right now because I think I'm in the process of coming to terms with what happened. Despite I've written things about it and said things about it, deep down, I'm not sure I fully grasped the moment. And it's the deepest crisis in my personal relationship with my country ever. And something that I don't think I've ever been thinking about, not in these kinds of terms. As I said before, my previous mode of operation, I think, was that you help your country and take, country, its agency, its polity, in a way for granted. There is a reality called Russia, and it has a history, and it has, it has some past, and it has, it's the way it's working right now, its design in a way, and every single part of that is under question, it needs to be reworked and understood and taken out of all of those previous contexts. Nothing is for granted. So it's like a big question.
Alexey, let's end with you appropriately, because you're on a train, and but in many ways, you and Russian journalists like you are on a journey. There was a certain certainty to your work when you were in Russia. You kind of knew what you were heading, and then you're forced to flee to Riga. So where is your journey taking you in the next little while, and what do you see as your future?
Okay, so first I wanted to say that I've probably spoken to more than 100 people in Ukraine now, and just one of them refused to speak to me because I was a Russian journalist, specifically because I was from Russia. I've spoken to many dozens of people, and every single one, I was struck by their good graces, because they were in unimaginable circumstances, but they kept answering my stupid questions about what they are, where they were right now, what happened to them. I had to go through all the excruciating details of their predicament. And I was struck by the goodwill of these people. And they didn't, I knew that in talking to them, one woman who just went for her entire life was destroyed. Her husband was killed. She was raped by Russian soldiers, but she messaged me on WhatsApp to wish me a good Palm Sunday. Although she later said that her own faith in God might not survive what happened. happened to her. But all these people, they kept responding to me, they kept talking to me, and I felt no animosity at all towards me. And they, obviously they were distressed, and they hated the Russian army, but this animosity did not extend to me as a Russian. So next thing I wanted to say is that there are very subtle, almost imperceptible differences in Russian and Ukrainian Russian. When you hear Ukrainian speaking Russian, there's a slight difference in accent, but there's also like a shibboleth in how Russians in Russian, Ukrainians speaking in Russian say certain words or certain phrases. For example, one of the most obvious ones is how you say "going to Ukraine."
Whoop. I think we've lost our our train travel.
The most interesting moment. Yeah.
That's right. Perilous moment. Well, look, we may have to leave it there. We might get Alexey back. Jim, over to you. I'd like to thank our panelists for just a fascinating.
I'm sorry.
There you are, Alex.
Yeah, I'm deeply finished.
It was a perfect way, right? You were talking about a dark moment, and then, but just wrap up in a few seconds what you wanted to say.
Okay, so there is a way of the way that Russians and Ukrainians speaking Russian say going to Ukraine. In Russian, it's going na Ukrainu, and in Ukrainian, it's v Ukrainu. And I've always insisted that the Ukrainians are very offended at the Russian way of saying this. And I've always responded that I accept that there are two versions of the Russian language, just like there is British, American, and British English and the American English, but I still wouldn't accept it. But now, from February 24, I switched completely to Ukrainu, and you know what? It costs me nothing. And I have no problems with speaking to Ukrainians anymore, because they're no longer offended at something that really cost me nothing to switch. And I'm now also offended on all the jokes I grew up with about the greedy, stupid Ukrainians. I'm not going to tell them anymore, and it also costs me nothing. And when we're speaking about reversing the Russians' imperialist attitudes, for us Russians, as I just saw in myself, it really costs me nothing at all. It shouldn't be really that difficult. I hope it happens within my lifetime. And I want to grow. I want to see in my lifetime, I also want to see the Russian society as united as Ukrainians are right now. Because what I saw, I'm really amazed at the spirit of these people. They're absolutely unbreakable. I don't want to see Russia to be just like Ukraine once.
Well, on that's a good optimistic note to end on. And I want to make sure you stay safe, Alexey, and same with you, Maxim, and your friends in Russia. And Chris, as you head into the war zone as well, please stay safe. And for all of you, just keep reporting, because we so depend on the risks you're taking to find out what's happening. Thank you all. Over to you, Jim.
I want to join Julian in thanking our four panelists. It was really quite moving, and I quite agree with Chris's observation that listening to Maxim and Alexey and Ekaterina gives me the first sense of hope that I've had in a long time. And it also emphasizes the important role that independent journalists play in our society, not only in Russian society, but in Canadian society and around the world. We owe a deep debt, all of us, to journalists and their courage and dedication to pursue truth and to inform the public what's going on. So we're really honored to have had the four of you with us today. And Julian, you're one of those fine journalists, so we're really honored as well that you were willing to play a key role in setting this up and to be the moderator. The video of today's conversation will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow. As well, we'll be posting a list of resources, some of the documents made reference to by our panelists today, links to their websites and their media outlets. So all that will be available to anyone who would like to see that on our website tomorrow. And our website is cfe.org. www.ryerson.ca. So you can go there, and you can also go there to see our upcoming events. There'll be one next week, which will be returning to our series on taming big tech, exploring the alternatives, with Elizabeth Denham, the former United Kingdom Information Commissioner, and before that, the Information Commissioner in British Columbia. But all of our materials are there. Again, I want to thank the audience for joining us today, but especially thanks to our panelists and our moderator for a truly moving session. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone.